Walk into Islands of Adventure, hang a left just past the port of entry, and within a few steps, the whole tone of the park shifts. The buildings turn loud and angular, painted in primary colors and stacked with oversized comic panels, and the Spider Man greeting guests looks exactly like he did on a newsstand in the mid 1990s, long before Tom Holland or even Tobey Maguire ever put on the suit. For a lot of visitors today, this is where Islands of Adventure feels its age. They know these characters from a decade of blockbuster films, and the version standing in front of them looks closer to a fan at a convention than the polished heroes on screen. It reads like a land Universal simply forgot to update. In reality, the comic book look survives because of a contract signed in 1994, one that has effectively locked the land into its original era. And it traces back to a deal Universal spent years chasing with an entirely different comic book publisher. The story of how it got frozen here starts with a land that was never supposed to feature Marvel at all. In the early 1990s, riding high on the success of Universal Studios Florida, Universal's parent company, NCA, started planning a second gate right next door. The early concept was a park called Cartoon World, built around famous comic and cartoon properties, and the crown jewel was supposed to be a DC Comics area. Universal worked with the design firm the Goddard Group on elaborate plans for a land split between Superman's Metropolis and Batman's Gotham City. Metropolis would have been anchored by a Superman motion simulator set inside a recreation of the Daily Planet, closer in style to Star Tours than a traditional dark ride. Gotham would have gotten a dueling roller coaster, pitting Batman against the Penguin, where guests picked which side's track to ride, plus a live Batman and Robin stunt show staged out over the lagoon, and a Joker-themed coaster with a false ending. On paper, it was spectacular. Then it fell apart over money. Universal offered Warner Brothers a 6% royalty to license the DC and Looney Tunes characters. Warner wanted 10. When Warner came back down to 8, Universal still walked, with executive Sid Sheinberg reportedly telling the room they didn't need Warner's characters. Warner already owned Six Flags by then, and simply kept its DC heroes in-house, an arrangement that still holds today. The Cartoon World idea eventually shifted into Islands of Adventure once Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park was folded into the plans, and the comic book section needed a new headliner. With DC gone and a park to fill, Universal turned to the other giant in comics, Marvel. Today that sounds like a windfall, but in the mid-1990s it was anything but obvious. There was no Marvel Cinematic Universe, no Iron Man at the box office, no Avengers. Marvel's movie track record was thin and inconsistent. Its comic sales were sliding as the speculator bubble burst, and the company was drowning in debt. Just 2 years after signing with Universal, on December 27, 1996, Marvel Entertainment Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, buried under roughly $610 million, while its owner, Ron Perlman, and investor Carl Icahn fought a brutal 2-year battle for control of the company. That fight only ended in December 1998, when a court-approved merger with the toymaker Toy Biz pushed both men out and finally handed the company the stability it needed to recover. So when Marvel signed its theme park licensing deal with MCA in 1994, it was a company desperate for revenue, handing its characters to a partner that actually had cash. Universal, for its part, got a deep roster of recognizable heroes for a fraction of what DC had demanded. Neither side could have known that 15 years later, Disney would buy Marvel for $4 billion and turn these same characters into the most valuable franchise in Hollywood, which is exactly what makes the terms they agreed to in 1994 so consequential now. The land that opened with Islands of Adventure on May 28, 1999, was built to look like a comic book brought into 3 dimensions. Because Universal had reworked concepts originally drawn up for DC, some of the bones carried over. The Superman simulator idea became The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man, and the Metropolis Freefall concept became Doctor Doom's Fearfall. Marvel's Superhero Island sits right at the front of the park, one of the first things you reach after the port of entry, a deliberate call by Universal, who expected Spider-Man and the Hulk to be major draws and wanted them visible immediately. The buildings are big exaggerated, and painted in saturated comic colors, with towering character art and forced perspective meant to make you feel like you have stepped inside a printed comic page. Some of the exterior paint even uses a technique that shifts color as the light changes through the day, echoing the vivid ink of a comic panel. The streets are wide and flat, which helps move crowds but also reinforces that two-dimensional graphic novel feeling. In 1999, this was a genuinely fresh approach to theming. The problem is that the entire aesthetic was tied to a specific moment in comic history, and comics, movies, and audience expectations all moved on while the land stayed exactly where it started. For all the talk of the land feeling dated, the rides inside it are anything but. The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man is still, in my opinion, one of the greatest dark rides ever built, and it has the hardware to back that up. It took roughly 3 years to produce and pioneered several new techniques, housed inside the enormous Daily Bugle facade and putting guests in vehicles that move through a blend of physical sets, 3D film, and motion simulation in a way nothing else had done at the time. It won Amusement Today's Golden Ticket Award for Best Dark Ride 12 years in a row, from 1999 until 2010, when its own parkmate, Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, finally took the crown. In 2011, the ride was refurbished with all new high-definition projections and a new soundtrack, a huge jump from its original visuals, reopening in early 2012. Just down the street is the Incredible Hulk coaster, a B&M machine designed by Werner Stengel, and one of the most recognizable pieces of the entire Islands of Adventure skyline. A tire-driven launch fires the train from 0 to 40 miles per hour in about 2 seconds through the Green Tunnel, hitting a top speed near 67 and running 7 inversions across its 3,700 feet of track. That launch draws so much power that Universal couldn't pull it straight from the local grid, so they installed on-site generators to store and deliver the energy without knocking out power nearby. In 2016, the whole coaster was rebuilt, with new track and new trains. The layout and green color preserved, but the hardware underneath completely replaced, and it reopened that August. The other 2 rides lean older and smaller, but they round out the land. Doctor Doom's Fearfall is the tallest ride at Islands of Adventure, 2 towers standing roughly 200 feet, using compressed air to launch riders skyward rather than the slow lift and single drop most towers of that era used. It's themed to the Fantastic Four, specifically their archenemy, Doctor Doom, whose Latverian embassy wraps the queue with a backstory about extracting fear to power one of his machines. Tucked behind the Hulk is Storm Force Accelatron, a spinning ride themed to the X-Men Storm that opened in 2000 to add a gentler, more family-friendly option, and it generally goes overlooked next to its neighbors. Beyond the rides, the same comic styling carries into Cafe 4, a fast casual spot themed to the Fantastic Four, and Captain America Diner, a retro burger counter with lagoon views out back. Character meet and greets are a staple, with Spider-Man, Captain America, Wolverine, and even villains like Doctor Doom roaming the streets. Here is where the age shows most plainly. Every one of them wears their classic comic book costume. A guest who knows Captain America from the Chris Evans films meets a version dressed straight off the printed page instead. For longtime comic readers, this is a charm, a walkable time capsule of how these heroes looked before Hollywood redesigned them. For casual movie fans, it can look like elaborate cosplay, and that gap is the single biggest reason the land feels stuck. Which raises the obvious question of why Universal, sitting on a decade of billion-dollar Marvel films, simply doesn't modernize the whole thing. The answer sits in the fine print of that 1994 agreement, and it is one of the strangest arrangements in theme park history. When Universal signed with Marvel, the deal didn't come with a fixed expiration date. Instead, the contract stated that once Universal opened its Marvel area, the agreement would continue for as long as the land stayed open and was operated, in the contract's own words, in a first-class manner consistent with the highest standards of the theme park industry. In plain terms, Universal secured the rights to these characters in perpetuity, meaning, effectively, forever, so long as they keep the land running and keep it in good shape. After Disney bought Marvel in 2009, that contract didn't vanish. Every clause carried straight over, which means Disney, the actual owner of Marvel, is bound by a deal its own property signed with a competitor years before Disney had any stake in it. Marvel can only exit the agreement for a genuine breach, like Universal letting the land rot or badly misrepresenting the characters, and Universal has zero incentive to ever let that happen. There's even language allowing brief closures for refurbishment or events outside Universal's control, so a temporary shutdown to rebuild a ride doesn't put the rights at risk. As long as the Hulk keeps launching and Spider-Man keeps swinging, the rights stay with Universal, and Disney stays locked out in Florida. So Universal keeps the land, but that still leaves the question of why they don't at least drag it into the modern era with Iron Man armor and MCU styling. This is where the contract turns into a genuine trap. The 1994 agreement requires Universal to follow Marvel's official style guides and get Marvel's approval for how the characters are portrayed. When the deal was written, those style guides were based entirely on the comic books, because the movies didn't exist yet. On top of that, the film versions of these characters, the exact faces and designs from the movies, belong to Disney. Universal has the theme park rights to the comic book Spider-Man. The Sony and Disney film Spider-Man that audiences picture today is a separate bundle of rights Universal simply doesn't hold. So even if Universal wanted to rebuild the land around the MCU look, they would need actor likeness rights, movie-specific branding, and Disney's direct sign-off, which Disney would obviously never give to its biggest rival. The contract does say Marvel can't unreasonably block improvements Universal wants to make, and by the letter of it, Marvel has to cooperate on reasonable upgrades. But it can absolutely block anything pulled from the films it owns, or anything that misrepresents a character's look, powers, or story. The result is a land that can be polished and maintained, but never truly modernized, held to a version of these heroes that stopped being the mainstream version 20 years ago. The 1994 deal did more than lock in a look. It drew a line across the entire country, using the Mississippi River as the boundary. East of the Mississippi, which includes all of Florida, no other theme park can use the Marvel characters Universal is actively using. West of the river, in places like California, other parks have far more freedom. And the restriction isn't limited to the exact characters on the island. The contract defines usage by character family. So if Universal features Spider-Man, then Disney is blocked from using Spider-Man plus the heroes and villains tied to him. Universal currently builds the land around Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Hulk, and the Fantastic Four, which sweeps in a huge chunk of the Marvel roster, including some of its biggest names. There's one more clause that shapes everything you see at rival parks. No other park is allowed to use the word Marvel in a land or attraction name. That single sentence is why Disney's Marvel Land in California is called Avengers Campus, rather than anything with Marvel in the title. It's also why Disney could quietly build Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind at Epcot in 2022, the first Marvel ride at Walt Disney World, since the Guardians don't fall inside any of the families Universal uses in Orlando. That family rule also explains a string of oddities in how Disney handles its own characters across the country. Doctor Strange, whose comic history reads as a largely standalone character rather than a core Avenger, has appeared for meet and greets at Disney's Hollywood Studios in Florida. Captain Marvel and Black Panther, by contrast, have generally been kept to Disney's California parks, because both connect closely enough to the families Universal uses, and Captain Marvel carries the Marvel name itself. Merchandise is where the logic flips. Retail sits under separate agreements, so Disney, as Marvel's owner, can sell Marvel-branded products anywhere it likes, while Universal can only sell goods tied to the specific characters it's licensed to use. Even Disney's 2019 acquisition of 20th Century Fox, which finally pulled the X-Men and Fantastic Four film rights back under the same roof as the rest of Marvel, changed none of the park math. Universal already features the X-Men and Fantastic Four families around the island, so those characters still can't headline an attraction at Walt Disney World, no matter who owns the movies now. Every one of these quirks comes down to a single agreement written when Marvel was worth a fraction of what it is today, and it's why Disney has spent years treading carefully around characters it technically owns. Universal did test the limits of that first-class manner clause exactly once, and it went spectacularly wrong. In 2002, Universal moved Halloween Horror Nights over to Islands of Adventure, and Marvel Superhero Island got transformed into a scare zone called Island Under Siege. The premise imagined a world where the villain Carnage and his allies had killed off all the superheroes, and the land was dressed to match, with wrecked police cars, villains wielding flamethrowers, torn Spider Man webbing, and Captain America's blood-stained shield nailed up inside Doctor Doom's tower. Fans of the event loved it, and it won Scare Zone of the Year. Marvel executives did not love it. Turning their family-friendly heroes into a horror show ran straight against the requirement to represent the characters faithfully, and Universal was promptly barred from ever using Marvel characters at Halloween Horror Nights again. It's a small piece of history, but it's a useful reminder that the contract cuts both ways. Universal holds these rights on a very tight leash, and stepping outside how Marvel wants its characters shown carries real consequences that stick around for decades. There are a couple of revealing exceptions that show just how specifically the contract is written. Disney Cruise Line openly runs Marvel Day at Sea, uses the Marvel name directly, features a Worlds of Marvel restaurant on its newer ships, and has even put Spider-Man on the stern of a brand new vessel sailing out of Florida, well east of the Mississippi. That looks like a flat violation until you read the fine print, because the agreement only governs theme parks on land in the United States. Cruise ships are treated as maritime operations, so Disney Cruise Line simply isn't bound by the same rules as Walt Disney World. The starker example sits in Japan. Universal Studios Japan ran its own clone of the Spider-Man ride, one so popular it helped push the park's attendance up by more than 1 million guests in a single year after it opened. But that deal was structured very differently. It had an expiration date, a fixed term understood to run around 20 years, with none of the in perpetuity language that protects Orlando. When it lapsed, Universal and Disney didn't reach a new deal, and the ride closed in January 2024, almost exactly on that 20-year mark. It's the clearest possible illustration of what Orlando's perpetuity clause is worth. In Japan, the rights expired and the ride closed for good. In Florida, the rights never expire, as long as the land stays open, which is precisely why Universal will never let it close. That reality is exactly why the recurring rumors about Marvel Superhero Island getting demolished or rethemed never quite add up. Every time Disney announces a new Marvel project, or Universal files a construction permit anywhere near the island, speculation flares that the land is finally on its way out. But there is no expiration date forcing Universal's hand, and nothing pushing them to surrender rights this valuable. The land is the legal mechanism keeping some of the most bankable characters in entertainment out of Disney's Florida parks, and closing it would instantly hand those rights to Universal's single biggest competitor, right in their shared backyard of Orlando. The heavy reinvestments tell the same story. Companies don't rebuild a coaster from the ground up in 2016, or pour millions into new projections on a dark ride if they plan to bulldoze the whole thing a few years later. Even with Universal pouring enormous money into its brand new Epic Universe park nearby, there's been no serious signal that Marvel is going anywhere. Keeping the land open, polished, and technically first class isn't only about guest experience. It's about maintaining a legal grip on Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the X-Men across the eastern United States. Even if the land feels stuck in 1999, that stagnation is doing enormous strategic work, and every well-maintained mural is part of the paperwork. And that's what makes Marvel Superhero Island so much more interesting than a land that just aged badly. It's a living monument to one of the strangest licensing deals the industry has ever produced, a gamble Universal made on a nearly bankrupt comic company that accidentally turned into a permanent chokehold on its rivals' most valuable heroes. Every time Disney spends hundreds of millions marketing the next Marvel film, it makes the characters standing inside Islands of Adventure more relevant, which amounts to free marketing for Universal, who has to do almost nothing to benefit from it. Meanwhile, Disney, the company that owns Marvel outright, gets a daily reminder that a chunk of its crown jewels are trapped behind a contract signed before the movies ever existed, worn in costumes from an era the films erased. The land will keep feeling dated because it legally has to, forever presenting Marvel the way it looked in the 1990s. And honestly, once you know the story behind it, That frozen quality becomes the most fascinating thing about the whole place. A comic book preserved in amber, while the world that outgrew it keeps spinning around it.